There's an old saying in the Western Territories that the most dangerous rattler is the one you never hear. And in the case of Sarah Swift Hand Matthews, that saying couldn't have been more fitting. From the dust-swept streets of Dodge City to the remote settlements of the Dakota Territory, her name would eventually become legend, not for the lives she took, but for the ones she brought into this world. Folks say she delivered over 3,000 babies during her time in the West, each one with the same gentle hands that could fan a Colt 45 faster than a summer lightning strike. But before we delve into the tale that would make her famous from Texas to Montana, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow we've got something extra special coming your way. Silver Creek, Wyoming Territory, spring of 1875. The town wasn't much to look at. A single dusty street lined with wooden buildings weathered gray by mountain winds and summer sun. The kind of place most folks passed through on their way to somewhere else. But for Sarah Matthews, it was exactly what she'd been searching for, a place where her past might finally stop haunting her. She arrived on a cool April morning, riding a sturdy bay mare with medical bags secured behind her saddle. Those who witnessed her arrival would later recall two things: the unusual sight of a woman wearing a gun belt high on her hip, partially hidden by a long riding coat, and the way she sat her horse, straight-backed but gentle, like someone who understood that strength didn't always need to be displayed to be present. Sheriff Tom Hawley, watching from his office porch, noted something else. The way her eyes never stopped moving, scanning every shadow, every doorway, every face. "There's two kinds of people who watch like that," he'd later write in his journal. "Those running from something, and those expecting trouble to find them." Miss Matthews, I figured, was probably both. Doc Morrison was the first to actually speak with her. The old physician had been looking for someone to help with his growing practice, particularly with the women's ailments he felt uncomfortable treating. Sarah's credentials from back east were impeccable. Training at one of Philadelphia's finest medical colleges, apprenticeship with a renowned midwife in Boston, and references that spoke of both skill and discretion. "Your hands," he'd remarked. During their first meeting, "they're not what I expected from someone with your background." He was referring to the calluses, the kind that come from years of hard work, or perhaps from something else entirely. "Life teaches us all different lessons, Doctor," she'd replied softly, her voice carrying a hint of something that made the old physician choose not to press further. Instead, he focused on her obvious medical knowledge and the gentle way she handled his instruments during her demonstration. Within days, Sarah Matthews had become an integral part of Silver Creek's small medical practice. She took a room above Rebecca Wilson's general store, setting up a small clinic for the women who soon learned to trust her capable hands and quiet manner. She paid her bills promptly, attended church on Sundays, and politely declined invitations to social gatherings with the excuse that her patients might need her. But there were things about the new midwife that didn't escape notice. The way she always positioned herself with her back to a wall, keeping doors and windows in sight. How her right hand never strayed far from her hip, even when treating patients. The fact that she kept her shutters closed at night, but a lamp always burning. Young Deputy James Wilson, more observant than most gave him credit for, noticed something else during his nightly patrols. "She practices," he told Sheriff Hawley one evening, his voice hushed with a mix of awe and disbelief. "Out behind the clinic, when she thinks no one's watching. Never seen anything like it, Tom. 6 bottles, 60 feet, 6 shots, all in the time it takes to blink." The sheriff absorbed this information with the careful consideration of a man who'd worn a badge long enough to know that everyone had secrets. Some were harmless, best left buried in the past. Others had a way of clawing their way to the surface, bringing trouble with them. What none of them knew, Not the sheriff, not Doc Morrison, not even young Deputy Wilson, was that Sarah Matthews' secrets were about to become the only thing standing between Silver Creek and the storm that was riding toward them. A storm wearing badge numbers that had been scratched off and carrying warrants that had never existed. Let me know if you'd like to hear part 2 of this story about the gentle midwife whose healing hands could deal death as easily as they delivered life. And don't forget to subscribe, because we've got more tales of remarkable women of the West coming. The first signs of trouble arrived in Silver Creek with the spring cattle drives. Rebecca Wilson noticed them from her store window, 3 men whose very presence seemed to darken the afternoon sun. They rode matched dark horses and wore identical tin stars that caught the light in ways that made her think of snake scales. U.S. Marshals, the leader announced to Sheriff Hawley, sliding a folded paper across his desk. Name's Carter. These are Deputies Myers and Jackson, tracking a fugitive who might have passed through these parts. Tom Hawley studied the warrant with the careful attention of a man who'd learned to read between the lines. The paper looked official enough, but something about the men's bearing set his instincts humming. Real marshals carried their authority differently, wore it like a well-broken-in saddle. These men wore theirs like new boots, too shiny and too stiff. Dangerous criminal? He asked, keeping his voice neutral. The worst kind, Carter replied, his thin smile never reaching his eyes. The kind that looks innocent. Woman, early 30s. Trained as a doctor or midwife, killed 3 men back east. Real tragedy, respected businessmen, pillars of their community. In her clinic, Sarah Matthews was attending to Katie Sullivan's difficult pregnancy when she heard the horses ride past. Her hands never faltered as she checked the young woman's pulse, but something in her eyes shifted, like storm clouds gathering on a summer horizon. "Miss Matthews?" Katie asked, noticing the change. "Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine," Sarah replied softly, her gentle smile returning. "The baby's positioned perfectly now. You should have an easier time of it from here on." But later that evening, Doc Morrison found her in the clinic's back room, carefully cleaning her revolvers. Not the work of an amateur learning to shoot, but the precise movements of someone who knew exactly how much their life might depend on well-maintained weapons. "Those men asking questions around town," the old doctor said, closing the door behind him. "They seem particularly interested in new arrivals." Sarah's hands never stopped their methodical work. "Are they now?" "Thought you should know," Morrison continued. "They've been showing a photograph around. Claimed it's of some dangerous fugitive." He paused, watching her carefully. "Funny thing is, when I glimpsed it, the woman in that picture was wearing a Philadelphia Medical College pin, just like the one you keep in your desk drawer." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken questions. Finally, Sarah looked up, her eyes meeting his with a directness that made him understand why she always seemed older than her years. "Those men who died," she said quietly, "they weren't businessmen. They were monsters wearing respectable suits. They hurt people. Young girls, mostly. Daughters of immigrants, women who couldn't fight back. The law wouldn't touch them. Too much money. Too many connections." "And someone did what the law wouldn't?" Morrison asked softly. Sarah's hands resumed their work, checking the action of her Colt with practiced ease. Someone gave them a choice. They chose poorly. In town, the 3 false marshals had taken rooms at the Silver Creek Hotel, their presence casting a shadow over the usual evening activities. Deputy Wilson, making his rounds, noticed how they watched the clinic with too much interest, like coyotes sizing up a henhouse. But what troubled the young deputy most was what he saw through Sarah Matthews' clinic window that night. The gentle midwife, who'd spent the afternoon delivering twins at the Peterson farm, was now moving through what he recognized as cavalry sword forms, her movements fluid and deadly as a mountain cat. The storm that had been brewing was about to break, And Silver Creek was about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous predator isn't the one that bares its fangs, but the one that hides them behind a healer's smile. Remember to hit that subscribe button, folks, because this tale of justice and vengeance is just getting started, and you won't want to miss what happens when these false marshals discover they're not hunting a fugitive, they're hunting a legend who's done hiding. Before we continue this tale of the healing hand that dealt justice, drop a comment telling us about the strongest woman you know. Now, back to Silver Creek, where the false marshal's arrival had stirred up more than just dust in the quiet Wyoming town. Carter and his men spent their first full day in Silver Creek, laying groundwork with the precision of experienced hunters. They separated, working different parts of town, building their trap one carefully placed lie at a time. Myers took the saloon, buying drinks and spinning tales about their fugitives' supposed crimes. Jackson worked the shops and offices, his soft voice and sorrowful eyes making his warnings about the dangerous woman seem born of genuine concern. But it was Carter who proved most dangerous, calling on the prominent families of Silver Creek, particularly those with something to lose. He visited Judge Harrison's house just before sunset, timing his arrival to coincide with the evening meal. "Imagine my surprise," Carter said, sitting in the judge's study, discovering someone with her background working as a simple midwife. Philadelphia Medical College doesn't exactly produce frontier healers. The judge, a man whose reputation for integrity had helped build Silver Creek, studied Carter carefully. "You seem to know a great deal about Miss Matthews. Know enough to wonder why a woman of her education would choose such a remote location." Carter's smile was cold as winter wind. Unless she had reasons to avoid more civilized areas, places where people might ask questions about her past. Meanwhile, Sarah Matthews was proving her worth to Silver Creek in ways that made Carter's insinuations fall on increasingly deaf ears. That very afternoon, she'd ridden 15 miles through threatening weather to reach the Anderson farm, where young Mary Anderson was struggling with a breech birth that had already claimed the lives of 2 previous children. Rebecca Wilson, who'd accompanied her as assistant, would later describe what happened. "I've never seen hands move so sure and gentle at the same time." She talked to Mary the whole while, soft as summer rain, keeping her calm. When things got dire, though, something changed. There was steel under that gentleness, like she was used to staring death in the face and telling it, "Not today." Both mother and child survived, adding to Sarah's growing reputation. But it was what happened on the ride back to town that caught Rebecca's attention. A rattlesnake, disturbed by their horses, struck at Sarah's mount. The midwife's hand moved faster than thought, her Colt clearing leather and firing in one fluid motion. The snake's head disappeared in a puff of dust. "Mighty quick with that iron," Rebecca observed carefully. Sarah holstered her gun with the same gentle precision she used with her medical instruments. "Life out here teaches you to be quick, one way or another." Back in town, Deputy Wilson was beginning to piece together troubling details about their visitors. The telegraph operator had mentioned Carter sending coded messages east, but not to any known law enforcement office. And Jackson's deputy's star had a telltale scratch where a different number had been filed off. He took his concerns to Sheriff Hawley, who'd been conducting his own quiet investigation. "Sent some wires to friends in other territories," the sheriff revealed. "No marshals matching their descriptions on any official roster, but there are stories. 3 men using marshals' badges to hunt down women who'd escaped from powerful men back east, women who knew too much." As night fell over Silver Creek, storm clouds gathered in the distance, their thunder echoing like warning shots across the valley. In her clinic, Sarah Matthews prepared for her evening rounds, checking on Katie Sullivan's progress. But beneath her medical bag, hidden from casual view, rested a gun belt that had seen far more use than most would suspect. The false marshals were building their trap, but they didn't realize they were trying to cage a legend who'd learned her deadliest lessons long before she'd ever picked up a gun. Stay tuned, folks, because this tale of frontier justice is about to show you why the most dangerous force in the West wasn't always the fastest gun, but the strongest heart. And if you're enjoying this story of a healer-turned-hunter, make sure you're subscribed for more tales of extraordinary women who shaped the American frontier. The story of how Sarah Matthews learned to handle a gun wouldn't emerge until much later, whispered around campfires and saloon tables like a prayer. But as Carter and his men tightened their net around Silver Creek, pieces of that history began, surfacing like bones after a hard rain. Doc Morrison found the first clue that evening, hidden in the pages of Sarah's medical journal, a carefully preserved newspaper clipping from Philadelphia, dated 3 years earlier. The article detailed the mysterious deaths of 3 prominent businessmen, all found in their offices with single shots to the heart. But what caught Morrison's eye was the smaller article below, describing how the daughter of one victim had vanished from a private sanitarium the same night. "They broke her," Sarah's voice came from the doorway, making the old doctor start. She moved into the lamplight, her face shadowed by memory. Richard Montgomery's daughter, Emily, 16 years old. They put her in that place to keep her quiet, called her mad when she tried to tell the truth about what they did to her and others. "What happened to her?" Morrison asked softly. "She died anyway. The damage was too deep." Sarah's hands, those gentle healer's hands, curled into fists. "But before she went, she taught me everything she knew about handling a gun. Her father, for all his crimes, had insisted she learn. A proper lady should be able to defend herself," he'd said. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Meanwhile, Carter was setting another piece of his trap. In the Silver Creek Hotel's dining room, he staged a conversation just loud enough for the right ears to hear. "Poor Judge Harrison," he remarked to Myers. "Imagine discovering your wife's trusted midwife is wanted for murder, especially with Mrs. Harrison so close to her time." The words spread through town like wildfire, exactly as Carter had planned. But Silver Creek's response wasn't what he expected. Instead of fear, the whispers carried defiance. "Sarah Matthews delivered my Thomas," Mary Sullivan declared in the general store. "Saved both our lives when no one else could. Don't care what she might have done before. That's the kind of debt that matters out here." Similar sentiments echoed across town. The West had its own justice, its own way of measuring a person's worth. And Sarah had been building credit in that moral bank with every life she brought into the world, every fever she broke, every wound she healed. Deputy Wilson, watching Carter's men from the shadows, noticed how their frustration manifested in increasingly aggressive behavior. Jackson spent more time at the saloon, his careful mask slipping after each drink. Myers took to openly carrying his rifle, the implied threat clear to anyone who crossed his path. But it was what happened at dusk that finally forced Sarah's hand. Katie Sullivan, heavy with child, was making her way home from Rebecca's store when Myers deliberately bumped into her. The pregnant woman stumbled, and only Sarah's quick intervention prevented a dangerous fall. "Careful there, Marshal." Sarah's voice was soft, but carried an edge sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. "Wouldn't want anyone thinking you're deliberately threatening an expectant mother." Myers sneered, his hand dropping to his gun. "Wouldn't dream of it, Miss Matthews, or should I say Dr. Montgomery?" The name hung in the air like gun smoke. Sarah's eyes never left Myers, but her right hand stayed well away from her hip, maintaining the image of the gentle midwife. "I don't know what you're talking about, Marshal. Now, if you'll excuse us, my patient needs rest." That night, Rebecca Wilson overheard Sarah and Doc Morrison in intense conversation behind the clinic. "They're not just here for me," Sarah was saying. They're cleaning up loose ends. Anyone who knows the truth about Montgomery and his friends is a target. They won't stop with just one death. The storm clouds that had been threatening all day finally broke, sending sheets of rain hammering against the windows of Silver Creek. But a different kind of storm was brewing, one that would teach Carter and his men the deadly difference between hunting a fugitive and cornering a legend. If you're as invested in Sarah's story as we are, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's installment will show you why they say the deadliest. Draw in the West wasn't about speed, it was about patience. The rain continued through the night, turning Silver Creek's dirt streets into rivers of mud. But while most of the town slept, shadows moved with purpose through the darkness. Carter had called a midnight meeting in the livery stable, away from prying eyes and listening ears. "She's not running," he growled, pacing between the stalls. "Montgomery's paying us good money to make this quiet, but she's forcing our hand." His face, lit by a single lantern, twisted with frustration. 3 days we've been here, 3 days too long." "Town's behind her," Jackson muttered, cleaning his gun with practiced motions. "Saw how they looked at me in the saloon today. They're starting to ask questions about our badges." Myers, standing watch at the door, spoke without turning. "Then we do it the hard way. Accidents happen in small towns. Fire starts in a clinic, spreads to other buildings. Tragic, but natural. But Sarah Matthews wasn't sleeping either. In her clinic, she was writing letters by lamplight, her normally flowing handwriting tight and precise. Doc Morrison found her there, drawn by the light in her window. "Last will. And testament?" he asked, noting the legal language at the top of one page. "Evidence," she replied, sealing another envelope. "Everything I know about Montgomery and his friends. Names, dates, victims. Been carrying it all in my head, but if something happens to me..." She met the old doctor's eyes. "These need to reach the right people." Morrison settled into a chair, his aged joints creaking like old leather. "You know, when I first came west, I thought I was leaving civilization behind. Took years to realize that what we call civilization often just masks the darkest parts of human nature." He studied her carefully. "Those men you killed, the ones they're hunting you for, they weren't your first, were they?" Sarah's hands stilled over the papers. "During the war, I worked in a field hospital outside Atlanta. Learned 2 things there: how to save lives and how to end them. Some of the doctors, they took advantage of the wounded women. Confederate, Union, didn't matter to them." Her voice hardened. "I got very good at making certain types of deaths look natural." Meanwhile, Deputy Wilson had positioned himself on the roof of the jail, using the rain as cover to watch Carter's men. He saw Myers leaving the livery stable, heading toward the clinic with obvious purpose. The young deputy's hand tightened on his rifle, but before he could act, a soft voice froze him in place. "Let him go, James." Sheriff Hawley emerged from the shadows. Sometimes the best way to spring a trap is to let them think they're the ones setting it. In her clinic, Sarah sensed Myers's approach before she heard him. Years of looking over her shoulder had honed instincts, sharp as any blade. She continued writing, but her free hand moved to the drawer where she kept her backup derringer. The knock, when it came, was surprisingly polite. "Miss Matthews, got a medical emergency out at the Peterson farm. They sent me to fetch you." Morrison started to rise, but Sarah's slight headshake stopped him. "Kind of them to send a marshal instead of coming themselves," she called back. "Must be serious." "Real serious, Mom. Best hurry." Sarah stood, gathering her medical bag with deliberate calm. "Just like Atlanta," she whispered to Morrison. "They always think they have the advantage in the dark." She checked her hidden gun with practiced ease. "They never learn that darkness favors the hunter, not the prey." The rain drummed against the windows like distant gunfire, nature's own percussion building toward the violence to come. Sarah Matthews, the gentle midwife with a killer's hands, stepped toward her door, ready to remind these men why the most dangerous predator is the one they never suspect. Before we continue with what happened next, hit that subscribe button and ring that bell, because tomorrow's chapter will show you why they say the quietest thunder makes the deadliest strike. Sarah Matthews stepped out into the rain, medical bag in hand, her boots making soft, splashing sounds in the puddles. Myers stood at the bottom of the clinic steps, his silhouette backlit by the distant glow of the hotel's lamps. Behind her, Doc Morrison watched from the doorway, his weathered face tight with concern. "Sure is dark for a house call," Sarah remarked, her voice carrying just enough edge to let Myers know she wasn't fooled. Strange that the Petersons would send someone they don't know, especially with their distrust of strangers. Myers's hand rested casually on his gun belt. "Maybe they're learning to trust authority. Something you might consider, Miss Matthews. Or should I say, Dr. Montgomery?" The rain continued its steady drumming, masking the sound of movement in the shadows. Carter and Jackson had taken up positions at either end of the street, their trap slowly closing. But what they didn't know was that they weren't the only ones moving through the darkness. Deputy Wilson, following Sheriff Hawley's lead, had quietly roused several trusted townsmen. They now watched from carefully chosen vantage points, waiting to see how the scene would play out. Rebecca Wilson, awakened by the commotion, stood at her store window with her father's old Spencer rifle, its barrel steady despite her trembling hands. "There's no Montgomery here," Sarah replied calmly, taking another step into the rain. "Just a midwife trying to help people who need it. Though I suspect there's no emergency at the Peterson farm. Is there, Marshal?" Myers's friendly facade cracked slightly. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Mr. Montgomery just wants to talk, clear up some misunderstandings about what happened in Philadelphia." Sarah's laugh was soft and bitter as winter wind. "Misunderstandings? Is that what we're calling murder and abuse now? Tell me, does he want to clear up what happened to Emily too, or to the others?" The mention of Emily's name triggered something. In Myers, his hand tightened on his gun, his voice dropping to a growl. "You should have stayed out of it, should have minded your own business like a proper lady." "I was minding my business," Sarah replied, her voice taking on the same gentle tone she used with frightened mothers. "Healing is my business. Justice is my calling, and some wounds can only be healed with lead." Carter's voice cut through the rain. "Enough talk." He emerged from the shadows, his badge catching what little light filtered through the clouds. "You're coming with us, dead or alive. Mr. Montgomery's preference is alive, but he'll understand if accidents happen." What happened next would be told and retold in Silver Creek for years to come. Sarah's movement was so smooth, so natural, that later witnesses would disagree about exactly when she drew. One moment her hands were empty, the next, her derringer had materialized as if conjured from the rain itself. "Last chance," she offered, her voice carrying the same calm authority she used in the birthing room. "Walk away. Tell Montgomery you never found me. Live to spend his money." Jackson's laugh echoed from the other end of the street. "3 guns against 1 small derringer. Those aren't odds I'd take, lady." Sarah's smile was visible even in the darkness. "Who said I only have 1 gun?" The tension stretched like a drawn bowstring, ready to snap. In the shadows, Deputy Wilson sighted down his rifle, waiting for Sheriff Hawley's signal. Rebecca Wilson's finger tightened on her Spencer's trigger, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the Wyoming sky. Nature's own countdown to violence. If you're invested in this tale of justice and vengeance, make sure to subscribe now, because tomorrow's chapter will show you why they say the deadliest force on the frontier wasn't the fastest gun, but the one you never saw coming. They say lightning striking twice in the same place is rare, but on that rain-soaked night in Silver Creek, Sarah Matthews proved deadlier than any natural phenomenon. The first flash came from her derringer, The second from the Colt that seemed to materialize from beneath her medical bag. Both shots finding their marks before Carter's men could do more than register the threat. Myers went down first, clutching his shoulder, his gun unfired. Jackson managed to get off a wild shot that shattered the clinic's front window before Sarah's second bullet sent him sprawling into the mud. Carter, proving why he led the group, had already dove for cover behind a water trough. "That's 2 men. Bleeding out in the rain, Carter," Sarah called out, her voice carrying the same steady calm she used when talking down anxious fathers-to-be. "I can save them or kill them. Your choice." Thunder rolled across the sky, drowning out Carter's curse. "You're surrounded," he shouted back, trying to regain control of the situation. "We've got men covering every exit." Sarah's laugh was soft but carried clearly through the rain. "Do you? Better check again." As if on cue, Deputy Wilson's voice rang out from the darkness. "Only men I see out here are wearing badges that don't belong to them." The young lawman's rifle gleamed dully in the lamplight as he emerged from his position. Other figures appeared from the shadows. Rebecca Wilson with her Spencer, Tom Sullivan with his shotgun, even old Doc Morrison standing in his doorway with a Civil War cavalry pistol. The people of Silver Creek had made their choice about which side of justice they stood on, but Carter wasn't finished. He fired twice in quick succession, forcing Sarah to duck behind one of the clinic's support posts. "Montgomery didn't just send us 3, he snarled. "Got 6 more men riding in from Cheyenne. Be here by dawn. How many of your townsfolk you willing to sacrifice for your crusade?" Sarah's response was to step fully into the open. Both guns held steady despite the rain. Lightning flashed, illuminating her face. No longer the gentle midwife, but something else entirely, something forged in the heat of war and tempered by years of witnessing humanity's darker nature. "You're lying, Carter," she said softly. "Montgomery's. Too careful to commit anything to paper, too smart to trust more than a few hand-picked men. That's why he sent you 3, his most loyal dogs. And now 2 of them are bleeding out in the mud." She took another step forward, water dripping from the brim of her hat. "I've spent 3 years tracking down every man who helped him hide his crimes, every corrupt judge, every paid-off lawman, every thug who kept his victims quiet. You're the last loose end." Carter's next shot went wide as Sarah's Colt roared once more. The false marshal's gun went flying into a puddle along with 2 of his fingers. His scream of pain cut through the night like a wounded mountain cat. "That's a surgeon's shot," Sarah remarked, approaching his fallen form. "Clean, precise, just like the ones that killed Montgomery's friends." She kept both guns trained on him as Sheriff Hawley emerged to apply handcuffs. "I could have killed you all, Carter, but death's too easy. You're going to live to testify. About Montgomery, about Emily, about all of it." As Doc Morrison moved to tend the wounded men, Deputy Wilson caught a glimpse of something in Sarah's eyes. Not triumph or satisfaction, but a deep, tired sorrow. The kind that comes from winning a battle, but knowing the war is far from over. Before we continue with what happened next, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's chapter will reveal why they say the most dangerous predator isn't the one that kills for pleasure, but the one that kills for justice. Dawn broke over Silver Creek like a fever finally lifting, painting the rain-washed streets in shades of gold. The night's violence had left its mark. Broken windows at the clinic, bloodstains washing away in puddles, and 3 former marshals locked in Sheriff Hawley's jail. But it was in Doc Morrison's surgery where the true aftermath played out. Sarah Matthews, still wearing her gun belt, worked alongside the old doctor with the same steady hands that had dealt out justice hours. Before, Myers's shoulder wound needed careful attention to prevent permanent damage. Jackson's injury, while less severe, required precise stitching. Carter's mangled hand demanded all of her surgical skill. "You could have killed them," Morrison observed quietly as they worked. Probably should have, considering what's likely to come next. Sarah's hands never paused in their work. Death is final, Doctor. Testimony carries on. She finished another neat stitch in Carter's hand. Besides, I took an oath to heal. Sometimes that means healing men who don't deserve it, so they can face proper justice. In town, the story was already spreading, growing with each telling. How the gentle midwife had outdrawn 3 trained killers. How she'd placed her shots with surgical precision, wounding but not killing. How the town had stood with her, choosing to believe in her brand of justice over false badges and corrupt authority. Rebecca Wilson, helping clean up the broken glass at the clinic, found Sarah's hidden cache of documents, carefully maintained. Records of Montgomery's crimes, witness statements, evidence that had been ignored by bought judges and corrupt lawmen. She wasn't just hiding, Rebecca told Deputy Wilson later. She was building a case, piece by piece, waiting for the right moment. But it was Sheriff Hawley who understood the true gravity of what was coming. In his office, he studied a wanted poster that had just arrived from Cheyenne, not for Sarah, but for Carter and his men. Impersonating federal officers, he read aloud to Deputy Wilson, suspected in multiple murders across 3 territories. That's good, isn't it? Wilson asked. Means she was telling the truth about them. Means Montgomery's getting nervous, Hawley corrected. These posters arrived too fast, too convenient. He's cutting ties, trying to distance himself from his veiled hunters. The old sheriff's face was grim, and men like that, when they're desperate, they're at their most dangerous. At the clinic, Sarah was cleaning her guns with the same meticulous care she showed her medical instruments when Katie Sullivan arrived, ready for her weekly checkup. The pregnant woman didn't even blink at the weapons on the examination table. Town's talking, Katie said as Sarah checked her pulse, about what you did, what you're really fighting for. She caught Sarah's hand. We stand with you, all of us. Whatever comes next. Sarah's mask of professional calm cracked slightly. What comes next might be worse than anything you've seen. Montgomery won't stop. Men like him, they can't afford to stop. Then he'll learn what frontier women are made of, Katie replied firmly. We're not some helpless city folk. We birth babies in blizzards and fight off raiders. We can handle one corrupt businessman. But Sarah knew better. In her years of hunting Montgomery's network, she'd seen how far his influence reached. As if confirming her fears, a telegram arrived for Sheriff Hawley that afternoon. Federal marshals en route from Cheyenne, arriving tomorrow, hold prisoners. Real. When's this time? Deputy Wilson asked. Hawley's face was troubled. Message came through Judge Harrison's office. Same Judge Carter visited when they first arrived. The storm might have passed, but Sarah Matthews knew this was only the eye of the hurricane. Montgomery was coming for her, not with hired guns this time, but with the full force of corrupted law behind him. Don't forget to subscribe, folks, because tomorrow's chapter will show you why they say the most dangerous weapon in the West wasn't a gun, but a determined woman with nothing left to lose. The federal marshals arrived the next day, but not from the direction anyone expected. Instead of coming from Cheyenne, they rode in from the east. 3 hard-faced men, led by a weathered veteran, wearing a cavalry colonel's coat, despite his marshal's badge. The way they carried themselves told Sarah everything she needed to know. These weren't Montgomery's men, these were real lawmen. Marshal Wade Hawkins, the leader, introduced himself to Sheriff Hawley. Been tracking Carter and his bunch for 6 months. Interesting how they always seem to find women with connections to certain Philadelphia businessmen. Sarah watched the exchange from her clinic window, her expert eyes noting details others might miss. The way Hawkins's coat bulged slightly on the left side, suggesting a shoulder rig in addition to his visible gun belt. How his men positioned themselves naturally to cover all angles. These were hunters who'd learned their craft chasing far, more dangerous prey than fake marshals. Inside the jail, Carter was coming to the same realization. His face went pale when Marshal Hawkins stepped into view. "No," he whispered. Montgomery promises a lot of things." Hawkins interrupted, his voice carrying the dry rasp of too many trail miles. "Just like he promised those other women before they disappeared. Emily Montgomery, Claire Thompson, Maria Rossi, all gone after they threatened to expose him. All except one." Sarah felt the weight of destiny settling around her shoulders as Marshal Hawkins turned to face her clinic. She knew what came next, had prepared for it since that night in Philadelphia when she'd first chosen this path. "Miss Matthews," Hawkins called out, "or should I say Dr. Sarah Montgomery, think it's time we had a talk about your brother." The revelation hit Silver Creek like a thunderbolt. Rebecca Wilson, standing nearby, gasped softly. "Brother?" Sarah stepped out onto her clinic's porch, head held high. "Richard Montgomery was my half-brother, same father, different mothers. He never acknowledged me publicly. A scandal like that would have ruined his reputation. But he made sure I got the best education money could buy, expected gratitude and silence in return. Until Emily," Marshal Hawkins added, "his daughter, your niece." "Until Emily," Sarah agreed, her voice carrying the weight of years of pain. "She came to me when she had nowhere else to turn, trusted me because I was family, told me everything about her father, his friends, their private parties with immigrant girls who'd never be missed. Doc Morrison had joined them now, his aged face showing dawning comprehension. That's why you became a midwife after Philadelphia. Not just to hide, but to help women like Emily. To be someone they could trust," Sarah nodded. "Someone who'd believe them, fight for them." Her hand drifted to her gun belt. "Die for them if necessary." Marshal Hawkins studied her with eyes that had seen too much of both justice and vengeance to judge either too harshly. Got telegrams from 7 territories, women speaking up about Montgomery and his friends. Stories they were too scared to tell before. "Your brother's empire's crumbling, Doctor, but he's not finished yet." As if summoned by his words, another rider appeared on the horizon, kicking up dust as he raced towards Silver Creek. Deputy Wilson recognized him as one of Judge Harrison's stable boys. "Riders!" the boy shouted as he reined in. 30, maybe more, coming from Cheyenne. Judge Harrison sent me to warn you. Says they're carrying federal writs signed by 3 judges. Montgomery's last play," Hawkins growled. "Trying to overwhelm us with paper justice, while there's still enough of his network left to make it stick." Before we continue this tale of corruption and courage, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's chapter will show you why they say the most dangerous thing in the West wasn't the size of your army, but the strength of your cause. Silver Creek transformed in the next few hours, its quiet streets becoming a fortress of frontier justice. Marshal Hawkins, recognizing the advantage of local knowledge, let Sheriff Hawley coordinate the town's defense. Sarah watched from her clinic as townspeople moved with purpose, following plans they'd developed during the night of Carter's attack. "Your brother's men will have the law on their side," Hawkins told Sarah as they reviewed their options. "Those writs may be bought and paid for, but they'll be legal enough on the surface. One wrong move from us, and everyone who helped you could face prison." "Then we don't give them anything to use against the town," Sarah replied, her medical bag open on the table as she prepared fresh bandages. "This is between Montgomery and me, always has been, but Silver Creek had other ideas." Rebecca Wilson arrived with 12 women, all carrying rifles and determined expressions. "We heard the whole story," she announced, "about Emily, about the other girls. We took a vote at the church. Silver Creek stands with you." Katie Sullivan, despite her advanced pregnancy, had organized a network of lookouts, children and older, folks who could move through town without drawing attention. 3 riders just came in the back way, she reported, headed straight for Judge Harrison's house. More papers, I'm guessing. Marshal Hawkins nodded grimly. Montgomery's trying to build his case before the main force arrives. Probably got witnesses ready to swear you're everything from a horse thief to a cattle rustler. Let them come, Sarah said quietly, checking her guns with practiced ease. I've got witnesses too, real ones. Been collecting their stories for 3 years, building a network of women helping other women escape men, like my brother. Doc Morrison, who'd been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up. The mining tunnels, the ones under the old part of town. Thomas Turner mapped them all before he passed. Eleanor still has his surveys. Deputy Wilson's young face lit up with understanding. We could move people through town without being seen, set up positions they won't expect. The plan came together quickly after that. Marshal Hawkins's men, experienced in urban combat from their army days, helped identify key defensive positions. The townspeople, knowing every quirk of their homes' layout, suggested modifications that would give them every possible advantage. But it was Sarah who saw the bigger picture. We're not just defending against guns, she explained, spreading out a map of the town. We're fighting for the truth. Everything I've gathered, all the evidence, it has to survive, has to reach people who can use it. As sunset approached, bringing with it the promise of violence to come, Sarah found herself in an unexpected conversation with Carter, now awake in his cell. The false marshal's face was grey with pain, but his eyes were clear. You don't know what you're dealing with, he warned, his mangled hand cradled against his chest. Montgomery, he's not like other men, doesn't think like them. When he can't buy what he wants, he burns it all down, takes everything you love just because you dared to stand against him. You think I don't know my own brother? Sarah's voice was soft but carried steel beneath the surface. I watched him destroy Emily, watched him smile at her funeral like nothing had happened. That's when I learned monsters don't always look like monsters. The last light of day painted Silver Creek in shades of blood and gold. From her clinic window, Sarah could see Marshal Hawkins's men taking up positions, blending with townspeople until you couldn't tell lawman from settler. They were ready. They were united. Don't forget to subscribe, folks, because tomorrow's chapter will show you why they say the most dangerous force on the frontier wasn't the man with the most guns, but the cause with the most heart. First light hadn't yet touched the eastern horizon when the lookouts spotted the first riders. They came in formation, their horses' hooves muffled by burlap wrapped around each hoof. A military trick that told Marshal Hawkins everything he needed to know about who they were facing. Ex-cavalry, he muttered to Sheriff Hawley as they watched from the church tower. Probably Pinkerton men. Montgomery's not taking any chances this time. Leading the column was a figure Sarah Matthews would have recognized anywhere, even after all these years. Richard Montgomery sat his expensive Arabian stallion like he was posing for a portrait, his tailored suit incongruous against the frontier backdrop. Beside him rode Judge Morrison from Cheyenne, his judicial authority lending a veneer of legitimacy to what was about to unfold. 37 men, Deputy Wilson reported after a careful count, all armed with new Winchester repeaters, 4 wagons. Following behind, ammunition and supplies, Sarah said softly from her position in the clinic. My brother always did believe in being thorough. She finished checking her medical supplies, bandages, laudanum, surgical tools all laid out with precise care. He'll try to negotiate first, make it look legal, that's his way. She was right. The column stopped at the edge of town, and Montgomery himself rode forward, a white handkerchief held aloft. He looked older than Sarah remembered. His dark hair, now streaked with silver, but his face still held that same cold confidence that had terrified Emily. I come with the full authority of the territorial court, his voice carried clearly in the morning stillness. I have warrants for several fugitives from justice, including the woman calling herself Sarah Matthews. Surrender them peacefully. And no one else need be involved. Marshal Hawkins stepped out onto the street, his badge catching the first rays of dawn. Funny thing about those warrants, Mr. Montgomery. Got some telegrams here saying they might be based on perjured testimony. Federal judge in St. Louis is mighty interested in reviewing them. A delay tactic, Judge Morrison called out. These warrants are perfectly legal, Marshal. Don't interfere with their execution. From her window, Sarah watched the theater playing out below. She saw what others might miss. The way Montgomery's men were subtly spreading out, taking positions that would give them clear fields of fire. The way the wagons were being positioned as cover, but Silver Creek had surprises of its own. Below the street, in the old mining tunnels, Rebecca Wilson led a group of townspeople through the darkness, emerging in pre-arranged positions behind and around Montgomery's forces. Others waited in root cellars and barn lofts, rifles ready. Last. "Chance, sister," Montgomery called out, dropping all pretense of legality. "Come out now, and maybe some of these good people survive what's coming." Sarah's response was to step out onto her clinic's porch, still wearing her midwife's apron, but with her gun belt clearly visible. "Hello, Richard. How's your conscience? Still sleeping well after Emily?" The name hit him like a physical blow. For just a moment, his mask slipped, revealing something dark and twisted beneath. "You dare speak her name? You who filled her head with lies?" The only lies she heard were from you. Sarah's voice carried the weight of 3 years of gathered truth. "But I'm not the only one who knows that anymore. Women all over the territories are talking, Richard, telling their stories. Your empire's already falling. You just don't know it yet." The tension stretched like a wire about to snap. Behind Montgomery, his men's fingers tightened on triggers. In the shadows of Silver Creek, townspeople and lawmen held their breath, waiting for the signal that would turn their quiet street into a battlefield. Before we continue this tale of justice, long delayed, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's chapter will show you why they say the most dangerous sound in the West wasn't gunfire, but the truth finally being spoken aloud. Dad of the Healing Hand. Part 12, the first shot didn't come from Montgomery's men, or from the townspeople, or even from Sarah herself. It came from Judge Morrison's own revolver, aimed not at any person, but at the church bell. The clang echoed through Silver Creek like thunder, making horses stamp nervously and fingers tighten on triggers. "Enough theatrics," Morrison declared. "By the authority of the territorial court." The rest of his speech was lost, as Sarah's voice cut through the morning air. "Tell them about Boston, Your Honor. About the girls who disappeared after visiting your private chambers. I have their statements too." The judge's face went pale, then red with rage. His gun swung toward Sarah, but never completed its arc. Marshal Hawkins's shot knocked the weapon from his hand with surgical precision, sending it spinning into the dust. That's when all hell broke loose. Montgomery's men opened fire, their new Winchesters filling the street with lead. But Silver Creek had been preparing for this moment. Return fire came from seemingly everywhere. Windows, rooftops, even from behind their own lines where Rebecca's tunnel group had emerged. "You've learned some new tricks, sister," Montgomery called out as he dove behind one of the wagons. "But so have I." On his signal, more riders appeared from the side streets, a dozen men who'd snuck into town during the night. They would have caught the defenders in a deadly crossfire, except Sarah had expected exactly this move. The thunder of Deputy Wilson's shotgun from the livery stable dropped 2 attackers from their saddles, while Katie Sullivan, despite her pregnant condition, proved deadly accurate with her deceased husband's rifle from her second-story window. Sarah herself moved like smoke through the chaos, her medical bag still slung over one shoulder, even as she exchanged fire with Montgomery's men. "A healer's work is never done," she had told Doc Morrison earlier. Now she proved it, pausing in the middle of the firefight to drag a wounded townsman to safety, bullets kicking up dust around her. Marshal Hawkins and his men, hardened by years of frontier combat, provided covering fire with deadly efficiency. "Like threading a needle," Hawkins muttered, as he picked off another of Montgomery's hired guns, trying to work his way around their flank. Gotta make each shot count, but it was Richard Montgomery himself who proved the deadliest threat. He fought with the desperate fury of a man watching his carefully built world crumble, and he had only one target in mind, working his way through the chaos. He managed to circle behind the clinic. Sarah sensed rather than saw his approach, years of looking over her shoulder having honed her instincts to a razor's edge. She turned, just as he burst through the back door, both their guns clearing leather at the same instant. "You should have stayed dead," he snarled. "After Philadelphia, you should have just disappeared like a good little sister." Like Emily disappeared. Sarah's voice was steady as her aim. Like all those other girls. Outside, the battle was turning. Montgomery's men, caught between the town's defenders and Marshal Hawkins's deadly accuracy, began to realize they were fighting a losing battle. Several threw down their weapons, while others tried to make a break for their horses. But in the clinic, brother and sister remained locked in their own private war. Guns aimed at each other's hearts across a room where Sarah had saved dozens of lives. "You know what Father always said about you?" Montgomery's smile was cruel as a winter storm, that you were the smart one, the one who could have had everything if you'd just learned to look the other way. He was right about one thing. Sarah replied softly, "I am the smart one. Don't move away, folks, because tomorrow's chapter will show you why they say the deadliest force in the West wasn't the fastest gun, but the one who knew exactly when to pull the trigger."